welcome.
Thank you.
Jim Goldgeier, very happy to receive you here at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. You're a visiting scholar at Stanford University Center for International Security and Cooperation, a visiting fellow at Brookings Institution, and a professor of international relations at the School of International Service at American University. We're very happy to receive you here and to talk a little bit about NATO's US relationship with Russia, the origins of the post-Cold War settlement, how it developed, and also where things started to go wrong, how they went wrong, and where we might head from here. This is part of a larger set of talks, the Transatlantic dialogues, which the Hague Center is sponsoring and which have been funded by the US Embassy in the Netherlands. So, the question that has come up a lot of times in the past years, since 2014, but again in the past year after Russia invaded Ukraine for the second time, is really how much of the Russian resentment, of the Russian actions, has been driven by NATO enlargement. And you were present at many of those discussions within the National Security Council staff during the 95-96 period when key decisions were taken.
Well, first of all, it's great to be here, so appreciate the invitation from the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. And I think, there are a lot of myths surrounding NATO enlargement. I think the important thing to understand is that the West wasn't out to get Russia. The West wasn't betraying Russia. There was a serious attempt to build a relationship both with Central and Eastern European countries that wanted to join the alliance for a variety of reasons, including fears of future Russian aggression. But there was also an effort to create a new relationship between NATO and Russia. And that was embodied in 1997 when the invitations were issued to Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. Preceding those invitations being issued was also the signing of the NATO-Russia Founding Act. And that was an effort to try to reassure Russia that NATO wasn't doing this in order to harm Russia, but was trying to create more stability across Europe in a way that would still recognize that Russia had security concerns of its own, and to try to balance all of these competing perspectives. And clearly, ultimately, the effort to integrate not only Central and Eastern Europe, but Russia into the West, ultimately, of course, that effort failed.
Would you say that there's a specific moment where it all went wrong? Was it the first wave of enlargement, the second wave in 2004? Is there any specific moment that we can sort of trace back the red line from the perspective of the Russian Federation?
Well, I think what you've just suggested is that NATO enlargement proceeded in a series of decisions. It wasn't one policy, one decision. There was the first decision to admit the first three in 1999. 7 more countries, including Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, that had been illegally incorporated into the Soviet Union and never recognized by the West as incorporated into the Soviet Union. Those countries joined in 2004. And the Russians were never happy about either of those enlargements, but the moment when things really went wrong in terms of the relationship between the West and Russia was 2008 with the declaration at the NATO Bucharest summit that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. This was something that the then U.S. ambassador to Moscow, Bill Burns, who's currently the CIA director under Joe Biden, he had warned folks back in Washington, cabling from Moscow, that the admission of Ukraine and Georgia did cross a red line for the Russians. And I think it was the problem with the Bucharest Declaration was multifaceted, but it basically made a promise to Ukraine and Georgia without putting either country on an actual path to membership. So it didn't really give them a path to membership, but it did anger the Russians, and I think that was clearly hugely problematic and contributed greatly to the Russia war with Georgia in 2008. But I think it's worth noting that in 2009, when Barack Obama came into the presidency in the United States, He established what was known as a reset with Russia, and in fact, relations with Russia improved. So even with the 2008 declaration, there was still an opportunity to improve the relationship. And so I just don't think that we can blame everything on NATO enlargement. It was a concern to the Russians. The idea of Ukraine joining NATO was a concern to the Russians. But I think it's way too much to argue that it's the contributor, it's the main factor in the deterioration of the relationship between the West and Russia.
And how much do you think that other events, other the wars in the Balkans, the wars in the Middle East, the decision to invade Iraq by the US, by the George W. Bush administration, how much do you think this played into a certain set of ideas within the Russian Federation that perhaps their position, their opinions didn't count for much anymore?
Well, there were a number of things that occurred between 1999 and 2003, 4, 5 that were actions undertaken by the United States and its partners, in at least the Iraq case, some of its partners, not all of its partners, but actions that the United States was taking that really had very little to do with Russia, but the Russians viewed them as threatening to Russia. So the 1999 Kosovo War, which I think was a much bigger deal to the Russians than the incorporation of Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, which also occurred in the spring of 1999. The Russians viewed the attack on Kosovo, attack against Serbia to defend the population of Kosovo, undertaken by the West to defend that population. The Russians viewed this as an attack on their ally, Serbia, and also were angry that this was done without UN Security Council authorization. The Russians would have vetoed it at the Security Council, so it could only be done without UN Security Council authorization. But that permanent membership on the Security Council, that ability to wield a veto, is part of what gives Russia claim to great power status. And so the Kosovo War undermined that. 2001, the Bush administration unilaterally announced that it was leaving the anti-ballistic missile treaty because it wanted to build missile defenses that would help protect the United States and its allies from threats from Iran, North Korea. Russians again viewed this as threatening to Russia. You have the 2003 Iraq War, where again the United States is going to war for reasons that don't really have anything to do with Russia, but Russia again views this, because it occurs without UN Security Council authorization, as threatening to Russia. And then you have the color revolutions in countries like Georgia, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan, which Putin views as directed by the West and as a threat to him personally and his rule over Russia, because of the potential threat that democracy in other countries would have for democracy in Russia. And I think you can carry this all the way up to 2011 with the UN Security Council authorized NATO war against Libya, which resulted in the overthrow and then death of Muammar Gaddafi. And I think Russia had abstained on that UN Security Council authorization, which allowed it to go forward. But I think Putin ultimately saw what happened to Gaddafi again as a threat to himself, and that the United States was bent on regime change in places, including in Russia. So putting all that together, I mean, he viewed these things as a threat. And meanwhile, his increasing authoritarian control over Russia and his desire to control territory around Russia was viewed by the West as a threat.
Right. So if we have such a wide scala of motivations on the Russian side to push back against the US, against NATO, if there's so many motivations and it's in a sense overdetermined maybe that we ended up in this situation, what would be feasible, acceptable steps to get out of this situation? Is there any way that we can disentangle this and kind of get the relationship between the US, NATO, Europe with Russia back on some kind of stable footing?
Well, until the Russians give up their designs on other people's territories, I think this is going to be really difficult. I think a Russia that said that it was content to live within the boundaries of the Russian Federation as internationally recognized with the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991, I think that that Russia would have no trouble in creating the basis for a better relationship with the West. But as long as Russia maintains imperial designs on neighboring territory, I think it's going to be extremely difficult. That said, there are mutual interests between the West and Russia, the United States and Russia. For example, nuclear arms control. That's something that the United States and Russia should both be interested in pursuing. And I think we have to find a way to try to have those conversations, although certainly in the midst of this violent war against Ukraine by Russia, that's going to be extremely difficult.
Mm. And with the war in Ukraine, if that doesn't end in a clear territorial settlement, by definition, it would be harder to find a stable footing for the relationship with Russia.
Yeah, and I think that a peace settlement between Ukraine and Russia is not very likely. I don't think Putin's particularly interested in a peace settlement, and I think it's very hard for Ukraine to negotiate away any of its territory, given what we know occurs on Russian-occupied Ukrainian territory. When any territory has been liberated, Ukraine has seen the kind of looting and torture and rape and assassination that has occurred on that territory. So how could they negotiate any territory away? So I think a peace settlement is going to be very difficult. And it may just be that relations with Russia remain fraught between the West and Russia as long as Vladimir Putin's in power. But he could still be in power for a long time. So we have to think about how we try to figure out a way to manage a relationship with a country whose aggression we want and have to contain, but a country that is right there on Europe's border and is a large country with thousands of nuclear weapons, and so it needs, there does need to be engagement at some level.
And so there will be engagement, but it's essentially you're also saying we should probably be prepared for a very long, painful struggle, both within Ukraine and in the relationship with Russia. So, playing into that is the struggle for the global narrative, where quite a few states in Latin America, in Africa, South Asia, most prominently India, Southeast Asia, are not necessarily in support of Russia, but are certainly ambivalent about clearly picking a side here. So what do you think that Washington's outlook is on that, and what are the opportunities for affecting that ambivalence?
Yeah, it's really a challenge, and it's interesting because the narrative for those of us in the United States and Europe, and I would say in parts of East Asia, countries like Japan, it's easy to recognize what the Russians have done as imperialist, as naked aggression, as an assault against against a sovereign country whose territorial integrity has been violated by force, and it seems like that should naturally be opposed. And we've seen it opposed in the United Nations. I mean, it is important to note that on UN votes, Russia has been isolated diplomatically. It's only had a handful of countries supporting it. There was the initial vote, 141 countries voting to condemn the invasion the full-scale invasion of Ukraine that occurred on February 24th of 2022. There was 143 votes rejecting the Russian announcement that it was illegally annexing 4 regions of Ukraine. So in that sense, we've seen strong global condemnation of Russia. On the other hand, when the United States tries to talk about imperialism in other parts of the world, you have people in parts of the world, Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere, who react and say, look, the United States has been an imperialist country, and so it's hard for the United States to gain traction with that argument. A lot of people will point to the Iraq War And I think it's frustrating, especially for an administration like the Biden administration, where you have a lot of people in that administration, Democratic administration, who opposed the George W. Bush war in 2003 against Iraq. I mean, it had been supported by then Senator Biden, but certainly a lot of Democrats opposed that war, and who will say, yes, we can accept that it was wrong for the United States to go to war against Iraq in 2003, but then, why can't people also accept that it was wrong for Russia to launch a full-scale invasion against Ukraine? Even if you believe the Iraq war was wrong, you can still and should still believe that the Russian war against Ukraine is wrong. But, countries are thinking about their interests. There's food security issues. And in the case of India, which has been very ambivalent during this war, the Indian dependence on Russia for arms sales, on energy, has led to India trying to balance its approach.
And it is not, I think, it's a question, right? This of ambivalence, of hedging. It's not a question that only needs to be tackled in the context of the Russian-Ukraine war and the future relationship with Russia, but also in terms of the Indo-Pacific, of trying to figure out how China's rise can be best fit into the existing order that both accommodates China's desires to an acceptable extent, but still keeps the interests in national sovereignty of other states in the region intact. In that context, how do you expect the specifically Southeast Asian states, which also are trying to hedge between the US and China and at least not try to explicitly pick sides, how do you think that that's going to play out, and which lessons could we take away from what's happening right now?
Well, I think the United States does recognize that countries around the world are hedging because they don't want to be forced to choose sides. And the Biden administration has tried to say that it's not asking countries to choose sides. And in fact, Secretary of State Blinken did that on his very first trip as Secretary of State to Europe in March of 2021, where he said, we're not asking countries to choose sides. Because I think the United States recognizes that it would be counterproductive to ask states to do so. On the other hand, the United States is trying to shore up its relations with its partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific, South Korea and Japan. Of course, reinforcing the relationship with Taiwan, which, there's great fear that China may miscalculate and invade Taiwan and create the possibilities of a broader war, which would be quite disastrous for all concerned, I think. But also, trying to work with other partners in the region. We talked about India. There's the Indo-Pacific Quad, which includes Japan, Australia, India, and the United States, and that's a very important forum for this administration to try to manage its key relationships in the Indo-Pacific region. And then you had the recent announcement about new U.S. military bases in the Philippines. The United States, sees the relationships with countries like the Philippines, with Thailand, with Vietnam. These are all important relationships for the United States. So the United States is trying to work within a context where it's not it doesn't want to antagonize these countries and recognize these countries have, for example, strong economic interests in their relationship with China, but also want to make sure that the United States also wants to work with countries that are rightly concerned about too much Chinese domination in the region.
Interesting, I think, here is also to note, you noted it as the Iraq War, the importance of it in further disturbing the relationship with Russia, as playing a role in many states in other parts of the world kind of looking right now and going, look, we know what the US did, so what Russia's doing now, from our vantage point, maybe there's not enough distinction for us to choose sides. The Iraq War also mattered in the US domestic debate about foreign policy. So in the wake of the Iraq War, whether it's certain politicians who are pushing for kind of a return to more narrow national interests, but also a great scholarly debate on whether the US should remain deeply engaged or maybe even more primacist in its approach in managing the world's problems versus those who were arguing for a more restrained policy, just try to kind of get out of many key regions or at least try to pass security costs off as much as possible. So where do you feel that debate stands in the wake of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which both saw tremendous transatlantic cooperation come together very quickly, but also might give some opportunities to kind of take some resources for the US point of view, to take some resources out of Europe?
Well, I think, Iraq, both the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War led to a sense in the United States that greater restraint in world affairs was warranted, that the United States had overextended itself, that it shouldn't be involved in wars like Iraq and Afghanistan indefinitely. Certainly Joe Biden came into office believing that he needed to end the forever war in Afghanistan, and we saw the very chaotic withdrawal in his first year in office. And I think, there's a lot of question as to whether or not that withdrawal contributed to Putin's miscalculation that the United States wouldn't respond the way it has in support of Ukraine. There's been strong bipartisan support in the United States particularly for the military assistance to Ukraine. And I think that will continue. There is a belief that the United States had to step in and work with its partners to try to push back against this Russian aggression. But there are voices on both the left and the right that are saying, look, we have problems here at home in the United States. We can't be expending these resources abroad. So far, the coalition in favor of supporting Ukraine is bigger than the coalition arguing that the United States shouldn't be doing what it's doing. And I would argue that in terms of the academic community in the United States, even those people who would describe themselves as restrainers and who felt that the United States should not have gone to war against Iraq, stayed too long in Afghanistan, shouldn't do as much around the world. I think a lot of those scholars are supporting the U.S. effort in Ukraine. I mean, it's just such a case of such blatant aggression by this major country against a smaller neighbor. Something that goes so profoundly against the UN system established after World War II that I think even a lot of restrainers are supportive of the U.S. effort to help Ukraine. But I think we haven't seen the last of this debate about how much U.S. engagement is enough in the world, and also what the U.S. relationship should be with Europe. I think that there is a sense that Europeans should do more for their own security, and that the United States can't be in the position where it has to always step in when there is a conflict in Europe.
So that might actually open the door for real discussion on what Europe has called strategic autonomy.
Yeah, I hope so. I really hope so, because the United States should have been supportive of European efforts to develop their own capabilities over the past 25 years. At every time that Europeans have talked about this, there's been a lot of ambivalence in the United States, concern that it's going to undermine NATO, concern that it's going to undermine the transatlantic relationship. I think, the old relationship where sort of the United States was the big brother and was really the dominant actor in European security and was there to provide a lot of the security for Europe. I think we need to move to a situation where there's a more equal partnership between Europe and the United States with respect to security, especially in Europe. It's the only way that the United States is really going to be able to rebalance its foreign policy toward the Indo-Pacific, which is what it's been trying to do for a couple decades now. But it keeps getting drawn back into other conflicts elsewhere, such as this war.
Yeah, no, it's something I think it's almost like a recurring gag at this point. The George W. Bush administration came to power, wanted to move away from Europe towards Asia. 9/11 happened, then the war on terror, the invasion of Iraq. Obama very much wanted to get out of the Middle East, Pacific pivot, but things in Middle East escalated again, and Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time, and then this administration. So how can the U.S. more fully, beyond the things you've already mentioned, how can the U.S. more fully kind of manage those different pushes and pulls in different regions? How can it kind of more balance those commitments?
Well, I think, I mean, it's hard. You know, the United States is a global actor, and you know, the problem is something happens in the world and people are saying, well, where's the U.S.? And it's pretty hard for the United States to just say, well, we're not going to get involved. But I think the place to start with Europe is recognizing that greater European strategic capabilities, even if it occurs through the EU and not through NATO, is good for the United States. And the United States has to get away from the idea that it has to be in charge in Europe. And the United States has had the view for a long time that it should be in charge of European security, and I don't think that that's productive.
Right. So I think with this administration, we've exited a period of turmoil in transatlantic relations during the Trump administration. Yet, also in the Biden administration, whether it's the fairly unilateral withdrawal from Afghanistan, how that was managed, the AUKUS deal with Australia and the UK, that kind of disadvantaged French industry. I mean, even this administration, despite how well it's managing the Ukraine conflict, has kind of had a few transatlantic spats. Same time, if we look at the overall history of the transatlantic relationship, it's been one of constant disagreements, crises. Is this the end of NATO? Is this the end of, and so on? And despite all those spats, disagreements, crises, it's also been an enduring relationship, an enduring, a very successful alliance that sort of outlasted its original purpose. So, as the US focus shifts inevitably more and more to the Indo-Pacific, what lessons learned can it take away from how it managed the transatlantic relationship that are applicable to the Indo-Pacific, but also maybe what lessons should it not try to apply to this very different context?
Yeah, I mean, NATO is special. I mean, you have this alliance of 30 and hopefully 32 soon, where, you know, you really have this effort to create an integrated set of relationships, interoperability in military terms, even if that's, you know, difficult to achieve. And particularly for the Biden administration, strong focus on the transatlantic, a deep feeling for transatlantic relations. I mean, President Biden steeped in transatlantic relations throughout his decades in the foreign policy arena. Secretary of State Blinken, you know, went to high school in France, deep ties to the transatlantic relationship, and others throughout this administration. I mean, so one question is, will that outlast this administration? I mean, this administration is really as transatlantic as it gets.
It's as good as it gets from the European point of view.
Right, yeah. And it's not clear, you know, that would continue after. And I think that what's interesting about the Indo-Pacific context is just, you know, it's so different because there isn't a NATO. You've got the bilateral relationships the United States has with different countries. You have the relationship with the Republic of Korea. You've got the relationship with Japan. You know, Taiwan. You know, there's a different type of relationship there, but President Biden has talked about on multiple occasions that the United States would defend Taiwan if Taiwan were attacked. You have these different types of relationships in Southeast Asia, which the administration has really tried to enhance since it came into office. As I was saying, the Philippines, you know, Thailand, a longstanding relationship with the United States there, and you know, Vietnam, which has emerged as a very interesting country given the history between the United States and Vietnam. And then, Australia is a key ally. This Indo-Pacific Quad, I think the thing to watch will be how will the Indo-Pacific Quad develop? It's a fairly informal relationship, but there's been more formality given to it with summit meetings and agenda items. Will it remain just a Quad? Will other countries, will South Korea, for example, become part of this network in a more formal way? And the United States and its within the Indo-Pacific Quad, those countries, Japan, Australia, India, and the United States, they've worked hard to ensure that those meetings are not viewed, that they're not sending a signal through the statements coming out of those meetings that they are, by design, anti-China. Most of what they talk about are, the issues of common interest and moving forward without talking about how this is fitting into a competition with China. But clearly, the goal of that entity, which isn't, going to become the basis for any kind of Asian NATO. India, is very eager to maintain, its non-aligned status, its status as a country that, doesn't have, formal strategic alliances like the United States has within Europe or has with Japan and South Korea. So I think we'll see that remain much looser, but it really will be interesting to see how this patchwork develops, because I don't think we'll see an Asian NATO, and so I think we'll see more of this patchwork of relations. And then the question will be, how does the United States try to engage its European allies in issues in the Indo-Pacific?
So there is a role for Europe. Is there a role for NATO in the Indo-Pacific?
I don't think there's really, well, there's a role for NATO in the sense that, NATO in its strategic concept that it released in 2022 is talking about the new, the need for NATO to take seriously the threat from China, and the NATO partnerships with countries like Japan and South Korea and Australia and New Zealand. There is, there is an effort to create. It's been a longstanding effort to have those global partnerships, and I think that, one of the things that is at the core of NATO is its Article 5 commitment: an attack on one is an attack on all, and that, refers to the transatlantic territory. I don't think anyone would see any kind of war in the Indo-Pacific as invoking Article 5, but I think there are countries, certainly like Britain and France, that are active in the region. I think that, from an economic standpoint, obviously Europeans have a lot invested in the region. I think if there were a war with China over Taiwan, the United States would expect its European allies to support the United States politically and economically as the United States pursued actions against China. But I don't think we'll see an expansion of NATO activities in the Indo-Pacific, but we will see NATO countries increasingly engaged, certainly in military exercises, for example.
Bilateral
I think more, yeah.
Maybe just one more question. We started the conversation, obviously, with the Western-Russian relationship, how it all went wrong, and in some ways that was perhaps overdetermined. Final question: what could we take away from how that relationship with Russia deteriorated, and apply that in whatever way to the relationship of the U.S., the West, the East Asian partners? How can we apply all those lessons, if any, to the relationship with China?
Well, if you'd asked me that question a few years ago, I would have said, well, it's such a different context because Russia was never integrated economically with the West the way China has been. You've had the energy dependence that Europe has historically had, with Russia. But even there, Europe now moving towards greater energy independence, you don't have the same kind of economic integration. And so a few years ago, I would have said, well, there's so much economic integration with China. I mean, there's just a limit to what kind of conflict you could have because there's so much mutual dependence. But one of the lessons that's been taken from the Russia war against Ukraine and the having Western businesses leave Russia is concerns about too much economic integration with China. And, again, a few years ago, I would have said to you, decoupling, I mean, what does that even mean? How could you decouple? These relationships are too tight. And certainly in the U.S. context, the U.S. is rapidly moving to thinking about how it can create more assurances with respect to supply chains. Western businesses are thinking about this. I'm currently, as you mentioned, visiting at Stanford, and so around a lot of people in Silicon Valley, and they're thinking a lot about sort of what a conflict with China would mean and trying to position themselves now to be less dependent on that relationship. And so I'm not so sure that mutual dependence is there as a bulwark against an overly conflictual relationship. I think that we are going to see more decoupling, and that may give more space to the possibilities for conflict than I would have thought 5, 10, 15 years ago.
Which is, that's unfortunately a daunting prospect,
Right.
and a little bit of a down note to end our conversation. But I would like to thank you again for both the other talks you've given here and for this conversation, which I think showed the kind of the breadth of debate that exists in the US and kind of the difficulty of how to tackle these multiple challenges at the same time.
Well, it's great to be here, and it's always great to be able to be in a place like The Hague where I can get a European perspective, since that's important for our own thinking in the United States, is to hear from Europeans as often as we can.
Thank you.